In 1999, Venezuela had a higher GDP per capita than China. 27 years later, its president faced a projected extraction by U.S. Delta Force at 2 a.m. Two nations, both democracies in 1999, both dealing with inequality, corruption, and political frustration. One elected Hugo Chavez, the other elected George W. Bush a year later. The gap between them wasn't obvious at first. Venezuela had oil wealth, the largest proven reserves on Earth. The United States had a diversified economy, but also mounting debt and deep political polarization. What happened next wasn't a competition. It was a controlled experiment in what happens when you dismantle institutions versus when you preserve them under pressure. When Chavez took power in 1999, Venezuela's democracy was flawed but functional. Courts operated with some independence. The central bank set monetary policy. Private media criticized the government openly. Elections were contested but accepted. Chavez didn't abolish these institutions overnight. He rewrote the Constitution through a referendum, legally, democratically. He expanded the Supreme Court from 20 to 32 justices and filled the new seats with loyalists. He created parallel legislative bodies that could override the elected Congress. The first real test came in April 2002. Military officers briefly ousted Chavez in a coup. He was restored within 47 hours, not by institutions, but by street protests and loyal troops. The lesson wasn't lost on him. Between December 2002 and February 2003, opposition forces launched a general strike that paralyzed the oil industry. Venezuela's economy depends on oil exports. Production dropped by 90%. Chavez responded by firing 18,000 state oil company employees, nearly half the workforce. He replaced them with loyalists. By 2004, he controlled the judiciary, the electoral council, and the National Oil Company. The institutions still existed on paper, they just no longer functioned independently. In the United States during this same period, institutions faced different tests. The 2000 election ended in a Supreme Court decision that half the country saw as partisan. The Iraq War was launched on intelligence many believed was manipulated. The 2008 financial collapse exposed catastrophic regulatory failures. But the Supreme Court remained independent enough to rule against presidents from both parties. The Federal Reserve operated without direct presidential override. Media criticized both administrations without being systematically shut down. When banks failed, they failed through legal processes, not executive decree. The institutions bent under pressure. They absorbed criticism, they made mistakes, but they didn't break. Oil prices surged from $20 per barrel in 1999 to $140 by 2008. Venezuela's government revenue exploded. Chavez used it to fund massive social programs, free healthcare, subsidized food, new housing construction. Poverty rates fell sharply. Infant mortality dropped. For millions of Venezuelans, life genuinely improved. These weren't propaganda numbers. International organizations confirmed them. But instead of building state capacity, training doctors, developing agriculture, investing in infrastructure that would last beyond the oil boom, the government distributed oil money directly. When you can import everything cheaply, you don't build anything domestically. By 2012, Venezuela was importing 70% of its food, despite having some of the most arable land in South America. Domestic production had collapsed. Price controls made farming unprofitable. It was cheaper to buy rice from Asia than to grow it locally. The United States, meanwhile, faced its own crisis in 2008. Major banks failed. Unemployment spiked to 10%. Housing prices collapsed. Millions lost their homes. The government responded with bailouts and stimulus packages, controversial, imperfect, and bitterly debated. But the response operated within institutional bounds. The Federal Reserve acted independently to prevent total collapse. Courts processed millions of foreclosures and bankruptcies through existing law. Congress blocked some presidential proposals and passed others. Recovery was slow. Inequality worsened. Many communities never fully recovered, but the economy didn't collapse. Chavez died of cancer in March 2013. Nicolas Maduro, his chosen successor, inherited an economy built entirely on the assumption of $100 per barrel oil. Then oil prices dropped to $30. Venezuela had no savings fund, no diversified economy, no independent central bank to manage the crisis through monetary policy. Maduro did what leaders do when they control the printing press but not the economy. He printed money to cover the gap. Inflation hit 65,000% by 2018. Not 65%, 65,000. Store shelves emptied. Hospitals ran out of basic medicine. People died from treatable infections. The average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds in a single year, not from dieting, from hunger. A country with the world's largest oil reserves couldn't keep the lights on. 7 million people left, out of a population of 30 million. That's nearly 1 in 4 Venezuelans fleeing the country. In January 2019, opposition leader Juan Guaido invoked a constitutional provision and declared himself interim president. The United States and more than 50 other countries recognized him. Maduro retained control of the military and most government institutions. For years, Venezuela operated with 2 competing presidents, neither able to govern effectively. The final breaking point came in the July 2024 election. Independent observers, opposition tallies, and leaked government data all indicated Maduro lost decisively. The government-controlled Electoral Council declared him the winner anyway with no verifiable evidence. The United States issued warrants for Maduro's arrest on narco-terrorism charges. He ignored them. Protests erupted. The military crushed them. Maduro remained in power, not through legitimacy, but through force alone.
What follows is a projected end state analysts warned about if Venezuela's institutional collapse continued unchecked. 27 years of institutional dismantling ended in a single night. 1 week before the operation, U.S. officials issued a final demand to Nicolás Maduro: surrender voluntarily or face removal by force. He refused. By that stage, intelligence agencies had already mapped Maduro's daily routines, where he slept, how he moved, and the security layers surrounding his compound. Special operations units trained repeatedly on a full-scale replica of the residence, rehearsing contingencies until timing and coordination were measured in seconds. In the early hours of January 2026, U.S. Special Operations Forces moved under radar avoidance conditions. Within minutes of breaching the compound, Maduro failed to reach a reinforced safe room. A brief firefight followed. U.S. forces sustained injuries but no fatalities. Several members of the Presidential Guard were killed. By dawn, Maduro was in U.S. custody and transferred to international waters. Within days, he was facing federal charges in the United States related to narcotics trafficking and organized crime. Inside Venezuela, the response was not what many feared. The military recognized an interim civilian authority within hours. There was no sustained resistance, no prolonged civil conflict. The transition happened quickly because the system Maduro left behind had already lost legitimacy. The structures of control still existed, belief in them did not. The international response was complicated. The UN Secretary General called it a dangerous precedent. Russia and China demanded Maduro's release and condemned the violation of sovereignty. Several U.S. allies publicly criticized the operation while privately expressing relief. But in the streets of Colombian border cities, crowds danced. Venezuelan expatriates in Buenos Aires, Lima, and Santiago celebrated openly. Inside Venezuela, reactions were divided, but the feared violent resistance never materialized. This wasn't about left versus right ideology. Chávez's programs genuinely helped millions when oil prices were high. American inequality worsened under both Republican and Democratic administrations. The difference was what happened when systems failed. In Venezuela, there was no institutional mechanism to remove a leader who lost an election, no independent court with the power to enforce electoral results, no legislative body that could check executive power, no internal process that didn't require external military intervention. In the United States, institutions repeatedly constrained disaster without preventing mistakes. The 2008 crisis was devastating. COVID response was chaotic. Political dysfunction is real and worsening. The Supreme Court has made controversial decisions. Congress often gridlocks, and the system itself shows signs of strain. Trust in institutions is declining, partisan polarization is intensifying, and the mechanisms that once held are being tested in ways they haven't been before. But when courts rule against power, power still complies. When elections are contested, institutions still process the disputes through established law. When presidents overreach, other branches still push back with legal authority behind them. For now. These aren't moral victories, they're mechanical differences. Institutions don't guarantee good outcomes. They don't prevent corruption, inequality, or bad policy decisions. What they do is limit catastrophic collapse. Venezuela and the United States both made serious mistakes between 1999 and 2026. Both struggled with corruption. Both experienced growing inequality. Both faced intense political polarization. But one maintained the ability to fail badly without collapsing entirely, to make recoverable mistakes, to correct course through internal mechanisms, however imperfect. The other lost that ability and required foreign military intervention to resolve a disputed election. Venezuela's economy has contracted by 75% since 2013. The United States economy grew by roughly 60% in the same period. That gap didn't come from better leaders. It didn't come from better people or superior culture. It came from boring, frustrating, slow-moving institutions that nobody particularly loves until someone tries to govern without them. Maduro's capture happened because Venezuela stopped functioning as a state, not because it lacked resources or potential, but because every institutional circuit breaker had been systematically removed. The method of his removal was extraordinary, precisely because the ordinary mechanisms had all been dismantled. The question was never which system produced perfect justice or optimal outcomes. The question was which system could survive its own imperfections long enough to correct itself from within. Venezuela couldn't, and on a January night in 2026, that answer arrived at 2 a.m. with Delta Force breaching steel doors.